Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How are you today? Shipmates. Well, good to see you up and around for another busy day. We've had a very quick trip, really, around the Baltic and these every day another country, but it's a beautiful place with a lot of history and a lot of culture, and so we get a taste of it, but you can always come back and stay longer and learn more. Today I'm just going to talk about our next two ports of Helsinki and Stockholm, where I have been many times. I'd worked actually on a Swedish ship for a number of years, and then I worked on a Russian ship. And we usually come to the Baltic to go to St. Petersburg, which is, of course, a glorious place, but in the midst of a crisis, I'd call it. So maybe someday we'll get to go there, and I'll show you just a bit about it. But with my grandson, every day we go out in the ports and go on a treasure hunt. So he has eagle eyes. He keeps finding things right under my nose in places. So in Copenhagen, he found a iPhone, brand new iPhone, sitting on a little corner of a bench in the park, and he picked it up and said, "Oh, I get a free phone," and on the back of it said, "Take me home." He showed it to me. I said, "Well, what do we really want to take a free phone home? It sounds dangerous to me." So I got to tell him the story of the Trojan horse, and other things. And then the other day in Bornholm, he found a wild rabbit on the dock, and it was hiding in a place. And so we asked if we could bring it aboard. And of course they said, "Well, we don't let any pets aboard, but we'll ask the chef." Well, anyway, we let it go, and it was forlornly waiting for the ship to come back, or some ship to take it away from its... It was in the midst of all those gigantic wind turbines, so I think it was a little confused, as are we all sometimes. But you can appreciate how this ship, like many great ships, has incredible coordination of people and provide all the services and the food. And so I call this kind of a cruise, and particularly Silver Seas, the most complicated business you would ever want to do. You have a ship, the design, the navigation, the accommodations, the food, the tours, and entertainment. So it's really a monument of human cooperation. And so the story goes that the staff, which kind of moves around, and they do multiple jobs to stay nimble and quick on all the services. So one day they think, well, why don't we trade jobs for the day? And so the captain and the chef and the chief engineer and the purser and the doctor, they all trade jobs for a day. And so briefly, the chef is in the engine room, and they call and say, "How are you doing?" I said, "I can't cook on these engines. They're just not warm enough." And then they call the captain, who's in the galley, and the captain says, "I can't believe you give knives to so many crew. There could be a mutiny, don't you know?" And so then the chief engineer is up here in the theater, and they call and say, "How's the show going?" So I have no idea what all these wires and lights, it's just too complicated. I'm only the chief engineer after all. And so they then call up to the bridge where the cruise director has been commanding the bridge, and so they call up and said, "Well, where are we?" And the cruise director said, I have no idea. And then they say, "Well, is the ship safe?" And the cruise director said, "Yes, it's safe because we've run aground." What? But the buses are there and the tours will continue. Anyway, I'm going to just show you a bit about where we have been. That's actually the great fortress outside of Helsinki, and we'll be landing right there, but I'll get further on. Anyway, we've come from, the ship actually was in Norway. Some of you were with us, so we came down the Kattegat at Oresund, Copenhagen, most of you've got on there, and Bornholm, Danzig, Lithuania, Klaipėda, and then Riga. That was a beautiful day in the afternoon there yesterday. And now we've come around to Tallinn, and then we'll go to Helsinki and then across to Stockholm. So this is a very unusual sea. I mentioned it before that it had been a freshwater lake, and all this larger landmass from northern Sweden and Finland and Russian territories and Poland and parts of Denmark all drain in fresh water into the great lake that was flooded by the sea in prehistory. But you might have noticed that the water in Riga was almost tea-like, brackishly brown and kind of tan, and that's because the Lithuania has and the whole area has a lot of pine bogs and marshes, and that just sort of leaches soil, and so the water is very I can't say it's polluted, except that it's full of plant matter. And so in previous times, the Baltic was full of fish and lots of birds, but the pollution from industrial sources and also from ship bottoms has made it somewhat of a poisoned sea. And so there's been a Baltic Sea conference to try to address these issues and to restore the fisheries and all this. But of course, now we have other more pending troubles. But anyway, it's still a remarkable place because you can see the kind of extent of it, because sandy beaches down here in Poland and in the south, and then you get ice-bound bays and very severe weather up there. And we are, of course, here in the high summer where it's never been this warm before. But again, we mostly know it by its human and political activity. So we were in Copenhagen, went down to Poland, up here. Helsinki is up right there. But notice how many lakes there are all through, particularly southern Finland is almost all water. And it's very, until recently, people were very, very isolated. Similarly, Sweden has a lot of very deep lakes. But I'll talk about Helsinki here in Finland, because as we approach any of these ports, they're all many, many islands, particularly on the Swedish and the Finnish coast. And so we'll come in past a lot of summer houses and then boat clubs and marinas like we've been seeing already. But Finland has thousands of islands on its coast, and many people have a summer house or a place to go just out of the city. This again is the Suomenlinna or Sveaborg fortress, which guards the harbor. It was financed and built by the French government in the 1750s as what they call the Gibraltar of the North, mainly in the competition with Russia, because the French and the Swedes were allied in the combat back in those bad days. But anyway, the fortress has never been taken, and it's changed hands between the Swedes, the Russians, then the Germans, and then now it's back in Finnish hands as not an active military post, but the remainder of the kind of conflicts that were all too often in this area. So you can go out, I know one of the tours goes out and hikes around. It's a very big park with many places to see, and even you can go aboard an old submarine. And there are monuments to the previous conflicts. But mostly the traffic just goes by to get into the harbor, and we'll be coming into a dock near the downtown. There's a shuttle bus right to the central market, which is walking distance from the ship if you go along the promenade. Nowadays it's very busy with markets and people, and they've just put in a floating swimming pool right in the harbor. So you may have seen this in Copenhagen. In the summertime, they put a swimming pool out so people can go downtown, go for a swim on the sunny days like this. This is the center square at the waterfront, and this famous statue of Havis Amanda, or they call it, well, let's meet with Amanda, and she's a rather shy model. And that's my wife there and our Finnish friend. They're all practicing their swoon. And then all around the square, you have monuments to particularly Tsar Alexander I. Back when Finland was part of the Russian Empire, it was the Grand Duchy of Finland. They were allowed to keep their language and their own local administration, but they put up some monuments to the Tsar. And last couple of weeks ago when we were there, this had been removed, and all the Russian glorification monuments have been either defaced or taken down because of the problems in Ukraine and such. But you'll see on the streets they still have the signs in Swedish, Finnish, and then Russian, because the population there is very mixed. Many Finn nationals speak Swedish, and many speak Russian. So this is all, let's say, in the neighborhood. But the Finnish people are mostly feel their roots are up in the countryside, either farming or fishing or lumbering and all these activities that are in the vast extent of the lakelands to the north. So right near downtown there is the statue to the ordinary Finn who has his reindeer and has his simple life and his handicrafts. And this is promoted now so that the Finnish people get more recognition for their own culture. And there are canals and classic Art Deco buildings and old boats all around. So you just walk around the downtown is plenty to see. They preserve a few of these to remind us how uncomfortable a cruise can be. Then there's a big market on the street this time of summer with a lot of countryside products and foods, and they serve a lot of fresh fish and big plates of kind of hashed potatoes and vegetables and things. So if you dare, that's a buffet right there on the street. And a lot of handicrafts, carvings, and reindeer products and things like this. And then an old market, which has this beautiful brick facade. But inside it, again, it specializes in products fresh brought to the city, including exotic things like bananas. I don't think they grow those there. But if you're really hungry, if you haven't had enough to dine on this ship, you can get fish baked in bread, and then reindeer meat, sushi, I'm sorry, it's a kind of sushi there, and even a little bear meat if you're really hungry, but you got to get the meat before he gets you. So the town sort of spreads out into a modern city. There's a lot of new buildings and development, but the Esplanade, they call it, has Marimekko designs and lots of flowers and lots of people out in this time of year. Of course, they put sweaters on all the statues later in the winter. But it's sort of a cafe society, so it's very busy. When we get there, it'll be full of life, and then come back in 6 months and you'll be the only person on the street. But the town has many elegant boulevards and old shopping buildings, department stores. This is the Swedish theater. So Sweden and Finland are sort of twin cultures, and again, there are many Finns who speak Swedish and go back and forth between these two countries, mainly by the ferries that connect them. Here's one of the libraries and one of the train stations, and this is a kind of a famous Art Deco style station there with these two guardian lamp holders. But right at the center of the square, up the hill from the market, is the Lutheran Cathedral, which is quite beautiful. It's very plain on the inside, but that's Alexander's Czar, and that has also been taken down as of a month or two ago. I'm sure that it's stored somewhere in case they have to pledge allegiance to the Tsar again, but we hope not. On the other hill across from there is the Upensky Cathedral, the Russian Orthodox Cathedral, which is quite magnificent. It's a brick structure with the onion gilded domes, and you can go in. It's open. All these churches are open. If you've never been into a Russian Orthodox church, it's very much a basilica style, and then it has a screen. The priests say the Mass in Russian behind the screen. They don't come out to the public, and the public all stands and sings along. So it's a very sacred place with icons, and many faithful go in there. But again, the problems with Russia now mean that there's a lot of, let's say, anxiety whether there'll be conflicts, as there had been so often in the past. So I kind of listed a legacy of the Baltic, which one author called it the haunted lands, just because there had been wars, famine, a lot of emigration, and some of these places have less people now than they did 100 years ago. And of course, their culture is spread through other countries and such. It's like someone in Riga said, most Latvians live in Canada now. It's just sort of typical. There are more of them outside than there are back in their home villages. And then I say a heritage of distrust and envy, just because each competing culture and then the militaries or the leaders have sort of taken turns beating each other up over the time. And so Scandinavia having a kind of glorious summer and then a depressing winter, they call their internal turmoil the war with the trolls. So I remember in Sweden, people said, "You think it's beautiful now? Come back in the winter and see how you like our cabin fever." Because similarly, it's dark all winter, and people have to either adjust or else they, unfortunately, drink too much. But the societies have evolved to to have famously social benefits for the people, full medical care, educational benefits, pension benefits, and all these things. But the pressure of modern times has meant that they've had to join, I go back here, the European Union, which a Swedish writer said it was like a Sicilian marriage. I got her pregnant, I have to marry her now. And now they've joined NATO. Sweden and Finland are the latest members, and that in itself sort of ends the tradition of neutrality, which Sweden and Finland had for so many generations. But the result of this is you get a fairly prosperous, a sharing economy, I'd call it, because the difference between the rich and the poor is not that much. The leaders are very, let's say, unbombastic these days, and the democratic process works. And so Finland in particular has been measured by whatever parameters as one of the happier countries in the world, just because it has ended up being independent, prosperous, and has the social benefits to make people have a predictable, stable life. You'll notice that there are many children in these countries just because they feel confident enough to, let's say, have a full family. So this is a new building in downtown Helsinki, which is the Udi Library. So this is a tremendous piece of architecture as just the downtown library. And again, these countries, maybe due to the long winter, have the highest literacy and reading rate of any part of the world just because they are cooped up half the year. But this library in particular is very spacious. But what I like about it is the librarian is a robot. You put in your title and the robot goes and gets it, and it probably gives you an opinion. You really should read something different than this. And who knows? I never met a robot who didn't have an opinion. And I have some friends who live in one of the downtown residential neighborhoods around this particular kind of a rocky park. And this is in Finnish history the site of the earliest prehistoric people who somehow came up to Finland, and they lived in a big cave, and they found the Neanderthal or whatever remains in the cave. And then they took the cave and made it into a church with an organ and a skylight. But unfortunately, now they're going back to its previous use as a bomb shelter. My friend looks out on this every day, saying, "Are we going to have a concert, or are we going to have air raid sirens?" And so that's the trouble of our times, which I don't want to dwell on, but you can read all about it in the paper, because Finland and the Baltic three countries all have the longest border with Russia right nearby, and they've traded territory back and forth over centuries, and it's almost, do we have to go through this tragic movie again? Currently, the Finnish border is closed because they were finding there were many people coming in illegally. They were being brought from the Middle East, and they were the Russians would send them off to go to Finland, where they were again given asylum. But they've now closed the border to stop that and to be let's say secure from any incursion. The whole border is very much militarized, including Finland has the largest army other than Poland in Europe, many times the German or the French or the British army, just because they've felt the heat before, and which is just down the Gulf of Finland. So here's the Russian Navy on Navy Day coming out of St. Petersburg. And normally we would go there and see all the beautiful things in the museums of St. Petersburg, but it's not welcoming tourists like it used to, which is too bad. But here's another scene of the newest tower in St. Petersburg, which is the Gazprom headquarters. And curiously, just after they finished it and celebrated this great new palace of business for the Russian economy, then the troubles began, and Gazprom has been cut off from fueling Western Europe, and now the company is all on the verge of bankruptcy after all of this trouble. But you can still see a lot of liquid natural gas and other oil tankers coming out past where we'll be in Tallinn and Helsinki. And so the sanction regime and the navies are all very much on high alert, hoping not to have the sabotage of the pipeline or the communication cables and things like that. And so this is just the time we live in. This Chinese flagship was accused of dragging its anchor and cutting the electrical and data lines to Estonia back a few months ago. And so now NATO and other navies are keeping a close watch on this area to sort of prevent any further more serious violence other than sabotage and such. So Sweden, I'd say uncomfortably, has been forced into NATO. It's a voluntary association. Nobody has to do it, but just for their own protection and their own guard, they have joined with Finland and Denmark and Poland to guard the Baltic. And at the center of the Baltic, there's one island that is considered the most strategic, which this is its flag as the shepherd of the faith, but it's the island of Gotland. Or we have any Swedes in the audience? Anybody been to Gotland? Because it's a famous place in Swedish history. It was where the Vikings built a fort to guard their trade routes to go to what's now Russia and all the way down to the Black Sea. But we tried to go there last month, but the weather was so bad we couldn't dock there. But it's one of the few places that still has its medieval city wall all around the old town. But in recent times it's been considered if there's a war, Gotland in the middle of the Baltic is the key strategic place to be guarded and secured. And so now the Swedish Navy and military have patrols all around Gotland and the coast. And so these are examples of the new Swedish frigates, which are very high-tech and very fast. And so we saw a couple of these in Stockholm harbor, and they look like some sort of a ghost ship. It's very stealth and bristling with communications gear. But they didn't have a very good lunch buffet. We were docked right next to them, and I said, "Can we bring you some pastries?" And they said, "Oh, the paperwork's too much. You eat them." Anyway. So they're practicing this sort of thing. It reminds me, I was once with a friend fishing in Finland, and he had a speedboat, and he kept cutting right next to the islands. And I said, "You're getting awful close. You're going to hit something." He said, No, we've been smuggling all kinds of things in these waters for so many years, and when we go right to the rock, the police boat goes a bit away, but they hit the other rock. So that's why we drive that way. Well, anyway, now they're practicing, unfortunately, the kind of maneuvers and things that might be called upon, but hopefully not. But I've never seen a tank driving across a frozen lake, but that's what they're doing. They're practicing for a winter war. And again, the Swedish Air Force and Navy are probably the tip of the spear and the most advanced. These are Griffin jets. And so this is the trouble of our times, and hopefully peace and prosperity will continue and we will solve this problem somehow. But anyway, I'm going to go now just to Stockholm and the Gamla Stad, the old town. And this is a city built on islands. And so it gives it a very interesting quality, because everywhere you turn there's another body of water and another channel. And the city was put out onto the archipelago on the east coast, but it's also connected to the great Mälaren Lake, which then extends up to all these other towns. And there are canal systems. You can take a canal boat from Stockholm to Copenhagen if you want. You're crossing all of the canals and lakes of Sweden. And it's very lush forest and agriculture, so it's a beautiful place. The city is very much the capital politically, economically, culturally. And again, it's spread out all through the different islands. So as we go in, if it's daylight, you'll see the ship has to navigate through all these little channels and around these little islands. And we go right through this one particular gap. Can you believe this ship can fit through there? Well, they say keep your elbows in from your balcony so you don't catch a tree on the way in. But this was vital defense for Sweden, and Stockholm in particular, because no one could get into the capital in a hostile way. And so these old fortresses guard all the channels. And Stockholm has remained the only European capital that has never been conquered by anyone else. And of course now we just want to go there shopping, so we don't have any other intent. But it's a beautiful area, just because there are thousands of islands. A lot of people have a house out in places, and then suddenly the city rises from this lake-like area. But everybody has a cabana and a little beach house. And so you'll see some of the fancier mansions as we go right into central Stockholm. In previous centuries, though, Stockholm was just a little fishing village, and the main capital back in, let's say, 1,000 years or even earlier was Birka. And so this is one of the areas that the Vikings prospered in by trading, and they fought. In the old times, Sweden was a competition between the Svea tribe and the Goths in Gothenburg, and they still complained about each other, sort of like East Coast, West Coast. But this area has the oldest remains of the graves of the Viking or the Nordic chieftains up in Uppsala, which is the university town north of Stockholm. And they've recreated some of the old earthen houses with the gateways, and that is what's traditionally called a vindö, or window, which means a hole in the roof so the smoke can get out of the house. So every time you open your window, that's the heritage. And so Birka and then Stockholm were run and founded by Birger Jarl. And Jarl means earl in English. And as a side note, anybody from Yorkshire and the city of York in England, and that name actually means Jarvik, which became in English York, and that's the Earl of the Bay. So my little village, fishing village of New York City, is named after a Viking earl like this guy, Jarl. Well, anyway, the people they're famous for raiding and their military assault on the rest of their neighbors, but most people were fishing and farming and trading. And the Viking, early Swedes and the Norse and the Danes had very extensive trade routes throughout, not just the Baltic, but all the way down to the Middle East and Spain and even North Africa. So in these tombs in Birka and outside of different parts of rural Sweden, they keep finding more ivory carvings and metal work. Particularly there's a lot of iron and rare earth metals in Sweden. So from prehistoric times, they've been metal workers and made these very fantastic chainmail and bronze helmets, and above all, very excellent swords. And that was their advantage in battle, was the quality of their metalwork. And so here's some Swedes on vacation going to spread peace and love, and they get in their armor, but they would also wear a special coat made out of bear fur, and that was in Old Norse called the berserk, and we call them berserk. We get that name directly from these lovely fellows. They're actually real sensitive men, like they should be these days, but they came up the rivers and onto the coasts of the UK and France, and because their longboat construction was so sturdy, and it was a double-ender, shallow draft, they could raise a sail or they could row it, they could go up rivers and invade places and that they thought nobody could get to, because deep-sea ships can't get up too far on a river. But now there are many reproductions of these longboats, and some of them more elaborate. Some of them were used for funereal burials and things like that, but they keep finding them in archaeology in the area. But you know that the various Vikings or Norse, however you want to call them, the Swedes mostly went into Russia down the rivers, and the word Russian means a red, as in the hair of some of these people who came all the way down to the Caspian, the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean. The island of Sicily was run by a Norse chief for many generations, and Spain, of course. Dublin was founded by Vikings, York, etc., and then Iceland, Greenland, and North America. So this was, let's say, the fabled Lord spares from the wrath of the Norsemen, who it goes on in Latin, said, they know no mercy, nor do they have any God. Of course, they did have gods, but they were only merciful for themselves. And here's a battle scene in the Mediterranean where the defenders are shooting what they call Greek fire on the Vikings, who eventually won anyway. And they became the guard of the court in Constantinople. So Emperor Theophasus had his Varangian guards who were from Sweden. And they were said they were so big compared to the other people that nobody would ever attack. And all around in Scandinavia in general, there are memorials to those who went away from home. And this one is a rune stone from Denmark, said that one son went to the east to Russia, and one son went to Iceland, and neither of them ever returned home. But they keep finding more grave sites and treasures that are buried, and some of them are Arabic coins or Persian lacework, and so this was an indication of just how prosperous some of these settlements were through trade. There was a union called the Kalmar Union in the 1300s, founded by Queen Margareta of Denmark, but it unified all of the royal families and tribal local leaders all the way to Greenland. And so that was meant to be a counterweight to the Holy Roman Empire, which was part of the continental European disunion at the time. But the Swedes had a conflict with the Danes, and they, under King Gustav Vasa, declared they would not be part of the Union, they would be an independent country. And so Sweden embarked on its own imperial time, controlling much of the Baltic, Finland, the Baltic states that we just visited, down into Germany. Their archenemy was the Danes at the time, and Norway was sort of too far away from much going on. But King Vasa is mostly remembered because he commissioned the biggest warship of his era, which was built in Stockholm harbor. And you know the story, and you can go visit it, because it was ceremoniously all decked out and launched and sent out, but because it had so many cannon right in front of the King Vasa, it rolled over and drowned most people in one of the greater nautical disasters of that period. The problem is they had too many cannons up too high, which is why we don't have cannons on the top deck around the pool here. But you can go into the great hall, which is across from the old city of Stockholm, and they picked the whole thing up, and then they have been preserving and documenting it. So it's one of the more remarkable feats of marine archaeology that they could keep it together, and they're still soaking it, keeping it wet and such, but it's you can see kind of the elaborate carvings and fittings of it, and then you can even down to the chamber pots. So Stockholm was a very prosperous and the center of a larger empire than it is today, because the battles went on as they tend to do. So in the Strait of Öresund across from Copenhagen, the Swedes came and drove the Danes out of southern Sweden. But then they had the conflict with the other neighbors, the Russians, who under Peter the Great came, and he sent his army all the way to Potlava, which is in Finland now, and defeated the Swedes. And so the Russians felt very proud. Well, now they have their neighborhood, and they have the right to these smaller countries because they once conquered them before. This is actually at the Peterhof Palace in St. Petersburg, and an example of the modesty and self-control that Russian leaders have been famous for. And on the subway line in Stockholm a couple of years ago, I took this picture because it says Potlava 1709, Berlin 1945. Some Russian wanted to remind the Swedes that they were not always, let's say, victorious. Well, I'll just go into the facts about the city. We will, I think the ship will either be in Söderhamn over in here. We can't get under the bridges, but this is the center. We might be out in a bigger dock and can bus into the main city. It's very small area, these islands, and then the extended newer town and things. The Vasa Museum is, I believe, right there. But if you're on tour, you can get around this town pretty quickly, or you can take local transport or just walk around and then it's a very well organized city, but you have to, if you rent a car, you got to be careful where you park. And it's very extensive. Now they built highways and metros and high-speed rail and all kinds of things. So the city has sort of spread all through the wider area. The airport is on the north up near Uppsala. But again, the lakes and the sea are all combined here. A lot of new building. This is the Sergelstorg, the central square shopping area, just north of the old city and the palaces. So like much of the Nordic world and everywhere else, it sort of preserves something old, but then it's always building something new. This is the Gamla stan, they call it, the old town. So it has the palace and the main cathedral and the government offices and a lot of narrow medieval era streets like we saw in Riga and other places. So you can just walk around and see this. I'll just show you some of the scenes of the old town, because it's become very lively with cafes and shops and such. It was pretty much abandoned 100 years ago for more sanitary facilities, but now it's all fixed up and a great attraction to go wandering around. And once you come out of the alleyways, you see these fantastic different churches and the palaces. This is the Riddarholmskirken, which is the main royal church in the old town, and features the tombs of the royalty. So Gustav Vasa and his descendants are all there, but there is a current king, King Gustav V, I think his name is, and Queen Sophia, but they have their own little apartment house downtown like there. And this is the city hall with the three symbols of the Swedish royalty up on the top of the dome. And then they have a cottage up on the lake where they occasionally find a room if it isn't already full. And then they have the Parliament building, which is downtown. But this is their main house in downtown Sweden. Oh, they took in their laundry. That's good. Okay. But this is open to the public. As a democratic right, you can go and knock on the door and ask them what's news in the world of royals. Well, a lot of the news is sort of tabloid gossip about who's what, why on the royalty, but they still have a lot of pomp and ceremony. So once I went there into the palace grounds, because they were having the changing of the guard and cleaning of the guns or whatever it was, but just like in Copenhagen and other places that have constitutional monarchy, they have the ceremonial guards, but only in Sweden do they have the mounted military band. And I have a friend who was commissioned to write music for this particular troupe, who come to the main interior courtyard, and they're on horseback with kettle drums and trumpets, and they parade around playing patriotic and nationalist songs. But this is the only musical cavalry in the world left. Except I think they're going to have one in Washington, D.C. sometime soon. The rumor is. But anyway, this only happens on special national day, so it's a rare thing to see, but so I showed it to you. And you can imagine the sound, but the horses just sort of hum along. But that's the Swedish royalty, which has its unique qualities. But mostly the city is full of canals and boats and beautiful sort of Belle Epoque era apartment houses. My friend who lives there has the biggest rooms of anybody I know that doesn't have their own palace. But on the island near the palace is the Nordic Museum. And it may be on your tour, you can go there on your own, because this was kind of the glory of the past was finally treasured, and it still has many things in this very sumptuous museum. But the pleasure of the city is probably best taken just going on a boat ride. If you don't have your own sailboat, you can always book a raid on this one. And they have residential boats. That one is actually a hostel, but there are a lot of people who live on their boats in the city and then go out on a nice day. This is the Chapman. You can actually book a cabin, but you got to bring your own butler. Oh well. And some people are really brave. Those are the real Vikings who will go out in traffic because there's a lot of, let's say, navigation going on. So I hope they didn't run into that Viking, because these come over from Finland and go down to Tallinn, go down to Riga. So there's constant traffic like this, mostly carrying cars and trucks. But just the waterways of Stockholm are, especially in the summer, are very busy and full of people going on family trips to go see the sites. But the newest thing in the harbor, which we saw, we actually went aboard last month, was the new Candela all-electric hydrofoiling speedboats. And now they're making a fleet of them like this one, which is so light, it's built out of carbon fiber. And so when it gets up to a certain speed with its electric engines and its advanced batteries, it can zip across the water at 30, 40 knots or kilometers, however you measure it. So this is a new industry in Stockholm, and they've just placed orders for Hong Kong, Mumbai, New York, and they even brought a test model to the Thames. Now, a lot of this is sort of goes into the racing world, but they're trying to make a ecologically convenient and clean transportation system for other cities that are on the water. You can see this amusement park just across from the palace, Gröna Lund, which is sort of like the modern Tivoli of Stockholm. But on a nice day, you can see how they are scaring children, which I always thought is a good idea, even on this one. So I'll take Pemba there and see whether he agrees to have fun, because sometimes you just have to have fun playing golf. I can't believe it. Or is that, what is it, polo? I'm shocked. Well, the trolls would be amused. That's all I can say. And so Stockholm is sort of a very, particularly this time of year, it's a very happy place, lots to see. And you just have to get the right guide, though. Don't follow that guy. So I'll just leave you with another curious sight on the way into Stockholm with this guy who's, I think, surfing. But it's full of wonders. And so I'll just say, Välkommen till Stockholm. And I'll give you a final saying of Benjamin Disraeli. Said, I saw more than I remembered on my trip, but I remember more than I saw. So I hope you all have good memories of this brief time together and make some friends and saw some things that surprised you. And here's another saying from Horace, from antiquity: time spent at sea does not add to your age. So if you stay on the ship, you'll just live forever. Maybe your bank account won't, but and then one more, which is from my old colleague Christopher Columbus: and the sea will grant new hope and bring dreams of home. And having worked on a Swedish ship once, we had a crew casualty, and we had a memorial service. And my Swedish Norwegian friends, they held a service, and they sang a traditional elegy, which, if you bear with me, I'll remember here. It said, Vem kan segla utan vind? Vem kan rå utan år? Vem kan lämna vänner sin utan fjällen tårar? Who can sail without wind, and who can row without an oar? And how can you leave a dear friend without tears falling? Jag ska segla utan vind, och jag ska rå utan år. Men vem kan jag lämna, du mina vän, utan fjällen tårar? I will sail without wind, and I will row without an oar. But how can I leave you, my friend, without tears falling? And I wish you a bon voyage. Thank you very much.